The shrill sound of the alarm clock cut through the silence in David Goldstein's room. He opened his eyes, blinking against the sunlight seeping through the gaps in the shutters. Another day was beginning in the hectic life of the young Jewish executive. David got up with the efficiency of someone who had every minute of the day timed. As he shaved, he observed his reflection in the mirror. Neatly trimmed dark hair, piercing brown eyes, and a face that emanated confidence. At 32, he was already one of the most respected businessmen in São Paulo's Jewish community. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled his penthouse apartment as he adjusted his silk tie. David picked up his Italian leather briefcase and left, leaving behind the silence of his lonely home. Subscribe to the channel and press the bell to see now how this amazing story will leave you shocked. In the elevator, he checked the messages on his state-of-the-art smartphone. Dozens of emails, meeting reminders, and a message from his mother asking about the family dinner that evening. David sighed, knowing that the subject of marriage would come up again. The streets of the Jardins neighborhood were already pulsing with the energy of the São Paulo morning. David got into his imported car, feeling the soft leather of the seat. The engine purred softly as he started it, blending in with the buzz of the city. Arriving at his company's headquarters, a mirrored skyscraper in the financial heart of the city, David greeted the security guard with a nod. In the panoramic elevator, he watched the metropolis awaken, feeling the weight of his family and community's expectations on his shoulders. The office on the top floor was a monument to success, designer furniture, contemporary works of art, and a breathtaking view of the city. His secretary, Rachel, was already waiting for him with a cup of coffee and the day's agenda. "Good morning, Mr. Goldstein," she said, efficient as ever. "The meeting with the investors has been brought forward to 10 a.m., and your father called to ask me to confirm your presence at dinner tonight." David nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "Thank you, Rachel. Please confirm my presence for dinner." The morning passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and important decisions. At midday, David decided to go out for lunch, something rare in his routine. He needed some fresh air and a moment's peace before the family dinner that promised to be tense. Walking down the stairs of the building, his thoughts were on the company's next merger when, turning a corner, he collided with someone. The impact sent a pile of papers flying through the air, scattering across the busy sidewalk. "I'm sorry!" exclaimed a female voice, clearly distressed. David looked down and saw a young woman crouched down, desperately trying to collect the papers before the wind blew them away. Without thinking, he bent down to help. "It was my fault," said David, picking up a few sheets. "I should have paid more attention." Their eyes met, and David felt something he couldn't explain. The woman had bright green eyes, wavy brown hair, and a simple but captivating beauty. She wore modest clothes, contrasting with David's impeccable suit. "I'm Sarah," she said, a slight blush tinging her cheeks. "Thank you for your help." "David," he replied, handing her the papers. Their fingers touched briefly, and David felt an electric current run through his body. "These documents look important. Can I buy you a coffee to make up for the inconvenience?" Sarah hesitated, glancing at her worn wristwatch. I should get back to work." "Please," David insisted, surprising himself. "It's the least I can do." After a moment's consideration, Sarah nodded with a shy smile. "All right, but just a quick coffee." As they walked to a nearby cafe, David couldn't take his eyes off Sarah. There was something about her, an authenticity that contrasted sharply with the polished, calculated world he was used to. What David didn't know was that this chance encounter was about to turn his life upside down, challenging everything he thought he knew about love, tradition, and identity. As they entered the cafe, the aroma of roasted beans enveloped them. David watched Sarah choose a simple table near the window, away from the prying eyes of the executives who frequented the place. He felt a pang of curiosity about her world, so different from his own. "So, Sarah," he began, as they sat down with their coffees, "what brings you to this part of town?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, her fingers playing nervously with the rim of her cup. "I work as a social worker in a children's shelter near here. I was on my way back from a meeting when we bumped into each other." David felt a surge of admiration. "That must be a rewarding job," he commented, genuinely interested. "It's challenging, but very rewarding." Sarah smiled, her eyes shining with passion. "What about you, David? What do you do?" Before David could answer, his phone vibrated insistently. It was a call from his father. He looked at the handset, feeling the weight of family expectations, and then back at Sarah, whose presence seemed to offer a strange sense of freedom. "Sorry, I have to take this," he said reluctantly. Sarah nodded understandingly, but David noticed a shadow of disappointment in her eyes. As he got up to take the call, he couldn't help thinking that this chance encounter could be the start of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. Subscribe to the channel and press the bell to see now how this amazing story will leave you shocked. The sun was setting over São Paulo when David arrived at his parents' mansion in Morumbi. The orange and pink sky contrasted with the imposing facade of the house, a mixture of modern architecture and traditional Jewish elements. David took a deep breath before ringing the doorbell. The meeting with Sarah still echoed in his mind, a bittersweet memory that made him question everything he had ever considered important. The door opened, revealing his mother, Rebecca, looking elegant. In a navy blue dress. "David, darling, you've finally arrived," she exclaimed, hugging him. "Your father can't wait to talk to you." The interior of the house was a testament to the Goldstein family's success. Expensive works of art adorned the walls, and the smell of kosher food filled the air. David followed his mother into the dining room, where his father, Isaac, and his younger siblings, Rachel and Benjamin, were already seated. "Son," Isaac greeted with a nod. His eyes, identical to David's, shone with a mixture of pride and expectation. "Sit down. We have a lot to discuss." Dinner began with the traditional blessings, Isaac's deep voice filling the room. David observed his family, feeling a strange distance that he had never noticed before. Conversations flowed around him, business, community, gossip, but his mind kept returning to his coffee with Sarah. "David," his father's voice brought him back to reality. "Your mother and I have some exciting news." Rebecca smiled, placing her hand over Isaac's. "We've finally found the perfect bride for you." The silence that followed was deafening. David felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. "What's it like?" he finally managed to say, his voice louder than he had intended. "The Levinsky's daughter," Isaac explained, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She's from an excellent family with a law degree. It will be a perfect match to strengthen her ties in the community." David looked incredulously from one face to the other. Rachel avoided his gaze, clearly uncomfortable, while Benjamin seemed more interested in his plate. "Dad, Mom," David began, struggling to stay calm. "I appreciate your concern, but I can't accept an arranged marriage. It's archaic." Rebecca looked shocked. "But darling, it's tradition. Your father and I met this way, and look how happy we are." "Different times, Mom," David argued. The image of Sarah with her sincere smile and sparkling eyes popped into his mind. "I want to find someone on my own, someone I really love." Isaac tapped the table, making the cutlery clink. "Love? What's love got to do with it? We're talking about the future of our family, our bloodline." The discussion escalated quickly. Voices were raised, accusations hurled. David found himself defending not only his freedom of choice, but a whole worldview he never knew he had. "You don't understand," he finally said, standing up. "There's a world out there beyond these walls, beyond our community, and I want to explore it." With those words, David left the dining room, ignoring his mother's calls. He grabbed his car keys and set off into the warm São Paulo night, his heart pounding in his chest. Without thinking, he found himself driving to the neighborhood where Sarah lived. It was a simple place, so different from the luxurious world he had just left. David parked the car and walked through the narrow streets, watching the people chatting on the sidewalks, the smell of home-cooked food in the air. He stopped in front of the modest building Sarah had mentioned earlier. He hesitated for a moment, wondering what he was doing there. Then, with a courage he didn't know he possessed, he rang the doorbell of the apartment. A few seconds later, the door opened. Sarah was there, wearing simple household clothes, her eyes widening in surprise at the sight of him. "David, what are you doing here?" He opened his mouth to reply, but the words failed him. How could he explain the whirlwind of emotions that had brought him here? Sarah noticed his troubled expression. "Is everything all right? Do you want to come in?" David nodded gratefully. As Sarah opened the door wider to let him through, he felt he was crossing more than just a threshold. He was entering a new chapter in his life, one that promised to be as frightening as it was exciting. Sarah's small apartment was the opposite of the mansion he had just left, but somehow it seemed more welcoming than anywhere David had ever been. As the door closed behind him, David couldn't help but notice the hesitation on Sarah's face. It was as if she, too, sensed that something important was about to happen, something that would change the course of their lives forever. Sarah's apartment was small but cozy. David looked at the walls, painted in muted tones, decorated with family photos and simple art. The contrast with the opulence of his own home was stark, but strangely comforting. "Sorry about the mess," Sarah said, quickly picking up some books scattered on the sofa. "I'm not used to receiving unexpected visitors." David smiled, feeling more relaxed than he had in years. "It's perfect like this," he replied, noticing the faint scent of lavender in the air. Sarah gestured for him to sit down and went into the small kitchen. "I'll make some tea. You look like you need it." While she busied herself in the kitchen, David let his eyes wander around the room. One photo in particular caught his eye. A younger Sarah smiling next to a girl who looked very much like her. "That's my little sister Leah," Sarah explained, returning with 2 steaming cups. Her tone of voice changed, becoming more serious. "She's ill. That's why I work so hard." David felt a wave of empathy. "I'm sorry, it must be hard." Sarah nodded, taking a seat next to him. "It is, but we do what we have to for the family, don't we?" She paused, studying David's face. "Speaking of family, what brings you here so late? Something seems to have happened." David took a deep breath. The emotions of the family. Dinner returning in full force. "My parents, they want me to get married to someone they've chosen." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "An arranged marriage? Does that still happen?" "In my community, yes," David replied, the bitterness evident in his voice. "Tradition, they say, but I can't accept it." Sarah was silent for a moment, absorbing the information. "And you came here because—" David met her gaze, feeling a connection he couldn't explain. "Because ever since I met you today, I can't stop thinking about how there are other possibilities, other worlds than mine." A soft blush colored Sarah's cheeks. She opened her mouth to reply, but was interrupted by a fit of coughing coming from one of the bedrooms. "Leah," Sarah muttered, getting up quickly. "Give me a minute." David watched Sarah disappear down the corridor, feeling suddenly intrusive. He stood up, walking over to the bookcase to give Sarah some privacy. It was then that he noticed a photo, partially hidden behind some books. The picture showed a family. Sarah, Leah, a woman who seemed to be their mother, and a man. The man's face looked strangely familiar, but David couldn't understand why. Before he could examine further, he heard Sarah's footsteps returning. "Sorry about that," she said, sounding tired. "Leah has difficult days sometimes." David nodded, returning to the sofa. "It's all right. Your mother, does she help with the care?" A shadow passed across Sarah's face. "My mom works 2 jobs. She's rarely at home." "And your father?" David asked, remembering the photo he had seen. Sarah tensed, her gaze wandering for a moment. "He's not with us anymore." David felt he had touched on a delicate subject. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked." "No, it's fine," Sarah forced a smile. It's complicated." The silence that followed was fraught with unspoken tension. David could sense that there was more to Sarah's story than she was sharing, but he didn't feel entitled to press. "Look," Sarah finally said, "I appreciate your visit, David, but it's late, and I have to get up early tomorrow." David got the hint. Getting up, he walked to the door, Sarah following him. "Thank you for seeing me," he said, turning to her. "I know it was unexpected." Sarah smiled, a genuine smile this time. "It was good to see you. I hope you find the answers you're looking for." When David left for the evening, he felt there were more questions than answers. The mystery surrounding Sarah and her family intrigued him, but it was the warmth he felt in their presence that really confused him. Driving back to his luxurious apartment, David couldn't help thinking about the partially hidden photo and the man's familiar face. There was something there, a piece of the puzzle that he couldn't quite fit together. Meanwhile, in the small apartment, Sarah sat on the edge of Leah's bed, holding a crumpled letter. Silent tears streamed down her face as she reread the words that could change everything. "What are we going to do now, Leah?" she whispered to her sleeping sister, the weight of an undisclosed secret weighing heavily on her shoulders. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind for David. During the day, he immersed himself in his work, trying to ignore the prying eyes and whispers that followed him through the corridors of the company. At night, he would meet up with Sarah, exploring the lesser-known corners of São Paulo. Their encounters were a mixture of excitement and caution. Sarah would take him to small neighborhood restaurants, alternative art galleries, and hidden parks. David felt like he was discovering his home city for the first time, through her eyes. One Saturday afternoon, as they walked through Batman Alley, admiring the colorful graffiti, David felt Sarah's hand slip into his. The simple touch sent a shiver down his spine. "Sarah," he began, his voice trembling, "I know we've only known each other a short time, but..." She interrupted him with a soft kiss, taking him by surprise. When they pulled away, they were both smiling. But David noticed a shadow of concern in Sarah's eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked. Sarah sighed, leaning against a wall covered in street art. "David, I'm scared. Your world and mine are so different." He squeezed her hand gently. "It doesn't matter to me." "But it should," she insisted. "You don't understand the complications, the secrets." Before he could elaborate, David's phone rang. It was Rachel, his sister. "David, you need to come home now." Her voice was tense. "Dad's furious. Someone from the synagogue saw you with, well, you know." David's stomach sank. He hung up the phone and looked at Sarah, who seemed to have guessed the tenor of the conversation. "Go," she said softly. "Your family needs you." With a heavy heart, David kissed Sarah once more before leaving, unaware that he was being watched from afar by a familiar figure. The Goldstein mansion was abuzz when David arrived. His father, Isaac, was pacing back and forth in the living room, his face red with anger. "How could you?" Isaac exploded as soon as he saw his son. "Parading around town in a shiksa, shaming our family, our tradition." "Dad, please." David tried to calm the situation. "Sarah is a good person. If only you knew her, know her." Isaac laughed bitterly. "Do you think I don't know who she is? The daughter of that traitor, that..." Isaac stopped abruptly, as if he had said too much. David felt his world spin. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. Rebecca intervened, putting a hand on her husband's arm. "Isaac, no, he doesn't need to know." "Know what?" David insisted, looking from one to the other. Isaac took a deep breath, looking suddenly older and more tired. "Sarah's father, he was my business partner years ago. He betrayed us. He almost ruined everything we built." David staggered at the revelation. "What about Sarah? Does she know?" "Probably not," Rebecca replied softly. "She was very young when it all happened." David's head was spinning. So many pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together. Sarah's discomfort at talking about her father, the hidden photo, the undisclosed secrets. "Son," Isaac said, his voice now more controlled, "you need to understand. This girl, however innocent, represents a part of our past that is best left buried." David looked at his parents, seeing the fear and worry in their eyes. But all he could think about was Sarah, her gentle smile, and the connection he felt with her. I need some time," he muttered, heading for the door. "David, wait!" His mother called out, but he was already leaving. As he drove aimlessly through the streets of São Paulo, David felt the weight of the revelations and family expectations crushing down on him. He wanted to run to Sarah, to tell her everything, but something stopped him. What if she didn't know? What if it hurt her? His phone vibrated with a message. It was from an unknown number. "If you want to know the truth about Sarah and her family, meet me in Ibirapuera Park tomorrow at noon. Come alone." David looked at the message, his heart racing. Who could it be, and what other revelations awaited him? As night fell over São Paulo, David found himself at a crossroads. On the one hand, his family and everything he had ever known. On the other, Sarah and an uncertain future full of possibilities. And now, a mysterious meeting that promised to reveal long-buried secrets. What would he choose? And what would be the price of his decision? Ibirapuera Park was buzzing with activity on that sunny Sunday afternoon. Families were picnicking, cyclists were hitting the trails, and couples were strolling hand in hand. For David, however, the idyllic setting was in stark contrast to the storm raging inside. He arrived at the agreed location a few minutes before noon, his heart beating fast. Who would be the mysterious sender of the message? What else would he find out about Sarah and her family? "David Goldstein," a familiar voice called from behind him. He turned around, surprised to see Benjamin, his younger brother, standing there with a serious expression on his face. "Ben? Was it you who sent the message?" Benjamin nodded, indicating a nearby bench. "We have a lot to talk about, brother." Sitting side by side, the brothers remained silent for a moment, watching the people go by. "How did you find out about Sarah?" David finally asked. Benjamin sighed. "I've been investigating on my own for a while, ever since I heard Dad and Mom whispering about the past coming back to haunt them." David looked at his brother with a mixture of surprise and admiration. Benjamin had always been the quiet, observant one in the family. "What did you find out?" "Enough to know that the story is much more complicated than our parents told us," Benjamin replied, pulling an envelope out of his jacket. "This belonged to Sarah's father. I found it hidden in Dad's office." With trembling hands, David opened the envelope. Inside was a letter dated 15 years ago and some financial documents. As he read, his eyes widened in shock. The letter revealed that Sarah's father had not betrayed anyone. In fact, he had discovered irregularities in the Goldstein family business and had threatened to expose everything if Isaac didn't rectify the situation. "That can't be true," David muttered, rereading the letter. "But it is," Benjamin insisted. "Dad fabricated the betrayal story to protect the family's reputation. Sarah's father was the scapegoat." David felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. His whole life, all his family's wealth and prestige, based on a lie? "Sarah needs to know about this," he said, standing up abruptly. Benjamin grabbed his arm. "Wait, David, think about it. This won't just affect Sarah, but our whole family, our community." David hesitated, the weight of responsibility falling on his shoulders. "What do you suggest?" "Talk to Dad first," Benjamin advised. "Give him a chance to explain, to do the right thing." Slowly nodding, David hugged his brother. "Thanks, Ben, for everything." As David walked away, determined to confront his father on the other side of town, Sarah was facing her own crisis. Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, the letter she had received weeks ago open in front of her. Leah, her sister, watched her with concern. "You have to tell him, Sarah," Leah insisted, her voice weak but determined. Sarah ran a hand through her hair in frustration. "How can I, Leah? Hey, David, guess what? Your father ruined our family, and now our father wants justice. That would destroy everything." Leah took her sister's hand. "But you love him, don't you? He deserves to know the truth." Before Sarah could answer, someone knocked on the door. Her heart leapt when she saw David standing there looking agitated. "David, what's wrong?" He came in, his eyes finding the letter on the table. "Sarah, we need to talk about our parents, about the past." Sarah's blood ran cold. She looked at Leah, who nodded encouragingly, and then back at David. "Yes," she said softly. "I think it's time the truth came out." As they sat, the air heavy with secrets about to be revealed, Sarah knew that whatever happened next would change their lives forever. David took a deep breath, taking Sarah's hands in his. "First of all, I want you to know that my feelings for you are real. No matter what we find out today, that doesn't change." Sarah nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "I feel the same way, David. But there's something you need to know." She picked up the letter from the table, hesitating for a moment before handing it to David. "This arrived a few weeks ago. It's from my father." David read the letter, his face paling. The letter detailed how Sarah's father had discovered the irregularities in the Goldstein family business years ago and how he had been unjustly accused of treason when he threatened to expose the truth. I already knew that," David admitted, his voice trembling. "My brother discovered documents that confirm all this." Sarah looked at him, shocked. "You knew? And you still came here?" "I came because I needed to hear it from you," he replied, clasping his hands together. "Sarah, I'm sorry for what my family did to yours. I want to make it right." Leah, who had been watching silently, intervened. "And how do you intend to do that, David? The damage has already been done. Our family has been destroyed." David looked at the two sisters, feeling the weight of his family's guilt. "I'm going to confront my father. I'll get him to admit the truth publicly and make it up to his family for everything they've been through." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "It's not that simple, David. This will affect many people, not just our families." "I know," David replied, determined. "But it's the right thing to do. We can't build a future together on lies and injustice." The silence that followed was heavy with conflicting emotions and difficult decisions. Sarah looked at Leah, then at David, feeling the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. David stood up, holding out his hand to Sarah. "We face this together. We go to my house and confront my father. It's time for the whole truth to come out." Sarah hesitated for a moment, looking at Leah for approval. Her sister nodded encouragingly. "Go," Leah said. "Do what needs to be done. I'll be here when you get back." With one last hug for Leah, Sarah took David's hand. Together they left the apartment, ready to face whatever fate had in store for them. As they drove to the Goldstein mansion, the sun began to set over São Paulo, casting long shadows over the city. David and Sarah knew that by the end of that night, nothing would be the same. Past and present were about to collide, and the future they dreamed of together was hanging by a thread. Subscribe to the channel and press the bell to see now how this amazing story will leave you shocked. David's car snaked through the streets of São Paulo, the city gradually transforming from modest neighborhoods to more affluent areas. Sarah watched from the window, her heart beating fast. With each passing block, the reality of what they were about to do weighed more heavily on her shoulders. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked for the third time since they left her apartment. David gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. "No," he admitted, "but I know it's the right thing to do." As they approached the Goldstein mansion, David began to reminisce about his childhood. The extravagant parties, the heavy expectations, the constant reminder that he was the heir to a legacy. Now that legacy seemed tarnished, built on lies and injustice. "How do you think your father will react?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David sighed deeply. "Honestly, I have no idea. My father has always been unpredictable when it comes to business and reputation." They finally reached the gates of the mansion. David stopped, the car hesitating before pressing the intercom. "Sarah," he said, turning to her, "no matter what happens in there, know that I love you. We're in this together." Sarah smiled weakly, squeezing his hand. "Together." The gate opened with an electric hum, allowing them to enter. The mansion loomed in front of them, imposing and intimidating. The lights were already on, creating long shadows on the immaculate lawn. Before they could reach the front door, it opened. Isaac Goldstein was standing there, his imposing figure framed by the light from inside. "David," he said, his voice controlled but tense. "And Sarah, isn't it?" Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. The man in front of her was responsible for years of her family's suffering, albeit indirectly. "Dad," David greeted, his voice firm. "We need to talk." Isaac studied them for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Come in," he finally said, taking a step to the side. The interior of the mansion was as opulent as Sarah had imagined. Expensive works of art adorned the walls, and the marble floor gleamed beneath their feet. Rebecca, David's mother, met them in the entrance hall, her face a mask of polite concern. "David, darling," she said, hugging him briefly before turning to Sarah. "And you must be Sarah. Welcome to our home." The tension in the air was palpable as everyone made their way to the living room. Benjamin, David's brother, was already there, sitting quietly in a corner. He nodded to David, a silent gesture of support. Isaac poured himself a drink before sitting down in his favorite armchair. "So," he began, his voice calculatedly casual, "to what do we owe this unexpected visit?" David took a deep breath, exchanging a glance with Sarah before speaking. "Dad, Mom, we know the truth about what happened to Sarah's father." Isaac's glass froze halfway to his mouth. Rebecca visibly paled. "What are you talking about?" Isaac asked, his voice dangerously low. David took the documents Benjamin had discovered out of his briefcase. "We have proof, Dad, about the false accusations, about how you ruined Sarah's father's reputation to protect your own." The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca let out a small sob, covering her mouth with her hand. Isaac seemed to have aged years in seconds. "You don't understand," Isaac finally said, his voice tired. "I did what I had to do to protect this family, to protect you, David." Sarah, who had remained silent until then, stepped forward. "And my family? Who protected it?" Isaac stared at her, a mixture of guilt and defiance in his eyes. "I'm sorry about what happened to your father, miss, but business sometimes requires sacrifices." "Sacrifices?" David exploded. "You destroyed lives, Dad. And for what? Money? Status?" The discussion that followed was intense. Voices were raised, accusations hurled. Rebecca cried silently, while Benjamin watched everything with an expression of resigned sadness. At the height of the argument, the phone rang. The shrill sound and cut through the air, silencing everyone. Rebecca answered with trembling hands. It's Rabbi Steinberg, she announced, her voice barely above a whisper. He wants to talk to all of us, now. The air in the room became even heavier. Rabbi Steinberg was a respected figure in the community, someone whose opinion carried weight. David looked at Sarah, then at his family. "Well," he said, his voice firm, "it seems the time has come for the truth to come out for everyone." Isaac reluctantly picked up the phone. Sarah held David's hand. They knew that what happened next could change everything, not just for their families, but for the whole community. The Goldstein mansion stood imposingly against the darkening São Paulo sky. David parked his car in the circular driveway, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. Sarah squeezed his hand, a silent gesture of support. "Are you sure?" she asked, for the third time. David nodded, determined. It's time for the truth to come out. Before they could reach the front door, Isaac Goldstein was already on the porch, as if he had been waiting for them. His gaze was a mixture of anger and fear. "Dad," David greeted coldly, "we need to talk." The family living room was a shrine to memories and traditions. Portraits of past generations looked on, silent witnesses to a confrontation that years of secrets had prepared. Rebecca appeared just behind Isaac, her face pale at the sight of Sarah standing next to David. "What's she doing here?" Isaac asked, his voice laced with contempt. David stepped forward, placing himself between Sarah and her parents. "She's here because it's time for you to tell her the truth about what happened to her father." The silence that followed was deafening. Isaac looked at Rebecca, a look of complicity passing between them. "I don't know what you're talking about," Isaac tried, but his voice shook. Benjamin, who had arrived discreetly, placed the envelope with the documents on the coffee table. "These documents prove everything, Dad. The alleged betrayal, the lies, everything." Rebecca let out a muffled sob. Isaac seemed to shrink, losing all his usual imposing bearing. "You've destroyed an entire family," David accused, "all out of pride and fear of losing your reputation." Sarah remained silent, but her eyes shone with a mixture of hurt and determination. She took her father's letter out of her pocket and placed it on the table. "My father always said that one day the truth would come out," she said softly but firmly. Isaac tried to argue, but the words died in his throat. The documents, the letter, everything pointed to the truth that he had hidden for years. "What are we going to do now?" Rebecca asked, her voice almost a whisper. David looked at Sarah, then back at his parents. "You're going to tell the truth to the family, to the community, and you're going to make up for what you've done." Benjamin supported his brother. "It's the only way we can start to fix this." Isaac looked defeated. For the first time in years, the patriarch of the Goldstein family looked small, vulnerable. "What about us?" Sarah asked David, her hand finding his. "What about us?" David pulled her closer. "Together. Whatever happens, we'll be together." The night wore on, and the Goldstein mansion held secrets about to be revealed. The family tradition, built on lies, was about to crumble. Outside, the city of São Paulo continued its hectic life, unaware that inside that house, the fate of two families was being rewritten. Isaac stood up, defeated. "I'm going to prepare a statement for the family, for the community." Rebecca watched him, silent tears streaming down her face. Decades of secrets were about to come to light. David squeezed Sarah's hand, feeling that everything was changing, not just for them, but for everyone there. "It's the beginning," he whispered to Sarah, "the start of something new." As night fell over the city, a new story began to be written. A story of truth, love, and reconciliation. The Goldstein mansion looked like a besieged fortress when David and Sarah arrived. The lights inside cast shadows on the meticulously tended gardens, creating an atmosphere of palpable tension. David squeezed Sarah's hand, sensing her nervousness. "We're in this together," he whispered, more to comfort himself than to reassure her. Before they could ring the bell, the door opened. Rebecca, David's mother, was standing in the doorway, her face a mask of shock and disappointment. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her gaze alternating between David and Sarah. "I came to tell you the truth," David replied firmly, "about what happened to Sarah's father, about the lies our family told." Rebecca stepped back, allowing them to enter. The living room, normally a sanctuary of elegance and tradition, now looked like a silent battlefield. Isaac Goldstein was sitting in his favorite armchair, a glass of cognac in his hand. When he saw Sarah, his face went through a series of emotions: surprise, anger, fear. "You," he said, his voice hoarse. "His daughter." Sarah stood her ground, surprising herself. "I've come to find out the truth, Mr. Goldstein, about what happened to my father." Benjamin, who was sitting discreetly in a corner, watched the scene. His eyes met David's, a mixture of support and concern. Isaac stood up slowly, placing his glass on the coffee table. "You don't understand what's at stake. Some truths are better left in the past." "No," David interjected. "No more lies, no more hiding the truth to protect our reputation." Rebecca tried to intervene. "David, please think about what you're doing. This will destroy everything we've built." Sarah took out the documents she had brought. "I have proof that my father has been wrongly accused. He discovered irregularities in the family business and was silenced." A heavy silence fell over the room. Isaac seemed to age decade after decade before her eyes. "What if I don't want to admit anything?" Isaac challenged. "Then we'll go public," David replied. "In the community, in the press, we will no longer allow our family to hide its mistakes." Benjamin finally spoke up. "Dad, it's time. The truth always finds a way out." Isaac looked at his children, at Sarah, at his wife. His empire, built on lies and manipulation, seemed to be crumbling around him. "You have no idea what you're doing," he muttered. Just then, the house phone rang. Rebecca answered, her expression changing rapidly. "It's Rabbi Steinberg," she announced, her voice trembling. "He wants to talk to us, now." David and Sarah exchanged a look. They knew that this call could change everything. The fate of two families, of an entire community, hung by a thread. And the truth was about to be revealed. "Well," said David, taking Sarah's hand, "I think it's time we face this together." Isaac closed his eyes, defeated. Rebecca held back tears. Benjamin watched, tense. And Sarah, the daughter of that man wronged years ago, felt the weight of history on her shoulders. The truth was about to be revealed, and nothing would be the same after that. The synagogue was packed. Prominent members of São Paulo's Jewish community filled every seat, the whispers and curious glances creating an atmosphere charged with anticipation. On stage, Isaac Goldstein stood motionless, holding an envelope containing documents that would change everything. Next to him, David and Sarah, holding hands, represented more than a couple. They symbolized the hope of reconciliation. Benjamin had prepared everything. The extraordinary community meeting would be broadcast live, ensuring that no detail remained hidden. "My brothers," Isaac began, his voice trembling, "I come today to confess a wrong that has stained our community for decades." The tension was palpable. Community leaders exchanged nervous glances. Some already knew that something significant was about to happen. Isaac revealed in detail how he had unfairly destroyed Sarah's father's reputation years ago. Compromising documents were projected onto a screen behind him, proving every word. "Not only did I harm an honest man," Isaac said, tears in his eyes, "but I shamed our tradition of justice and integrity." Sarah watched, her body tense. Beside her, David held her, offering silent support. Suddenly, a man stood up at the back of the hall. It was Sarah's father, whom no one had expected to see there. "I've come to hear the truth," he declared, his voice firm despite years of suffering. The confrontation was about to take place. Isaac invited the man onto the stage, a gesture of humility that surprised everyone. "I beg your pardon," Isaac said, holding out his hand. The moment was cinematic. Two men who had been enemies for decades, now standing face to face in front of the whole community. Sarah's father hesitated for a moment. Then, surprising everyone, he shook Isaac's hand. "Forgiveness won't be easy," he said, "but it's necessary." David felt Sarah tremble beside him. He knew that this moment represented much more than a personal reconciliation. It was the healing of a communal wound, but the biggest surprise was yet to come. One of the older community leaders stood up. He was holding additional documents that no one had expected. "There's more," he announced. "Evidence that others were also involved in this conspiracy." The hall erupted in murmurs. Reputations were about to be destroyed, secrets revealed. Sarah looked at David, her eyes conveying a mixture of fear and hope. He pulled her closer, sealing a silent commitment. "Whatever the outcome," David whispered, "we will be together." The community leader continued to reveal details. Important. Names would be exposed, fortunes would be shaken. The Jewish community of São Paulo would never be the same again. Isaac, trembling, remained on stage. His confession had opened a Pandora's box of secrets and betrayals. Sarah felt a tear roll down her cheek. Decades of hurt, of injustice, were finally being confronted. David squeezed her hand. Their love had triggered this silent revolution. "It's the end of something," Sarah murmured, "and the beginning of something else." On stage, Isaac continued his confession. At the back of the hall, reactions ranged from shock to relief. The truth was finally being revealed, and at the center of it all, David and Sarah, symbols of hope, love, and reconciliation. 6 months after the revelation in the synagogue, São Paulo seemed like a different city. The wounds of the Jewish community were beginning to heal, and a new era of transparency and reconciliation had begun. David and Sarah were sitting on the terrace of her apartment, watching Leah, who was now receiving medical treatment thanks to the compensation the Goldstein family had paid. "Who knew," Sarah said, resting her head on David's shoulder, "that everything would change like this?" Isaac's confession had triggered a series of transformations. Several wronged families were compensated, community leaders were renewed, and a new culture of openness began to take hold. Isaac, although still struggling to recover his reputation, had become an advocate for justice and transparency. Rebecca supported him, both working to repair the damage caused by years of secrecy. Benjamin had taken the lead in the family business, implementing more ethical and transparent practices. His courage in supporting the truth had made him a respected leader. Sarah's father, after years of hurt, had found a peace he had never imagined possible. He and Isaac had begun a difficult but necessary dialogue. "What about the wedding?" Leah asked, interrupting Sarah's thoughts. David smiled, taking Sarah's hand. "We're planning it, but we want to do it differently. No pressure, no traditional expectations." An intimate ceremony was being organized, which would celebrate not only their union, but the reconciliation of two families and an entire community. Sarah's phone rang. It was a call from the shelter where she worked, offering her a coordinating position. The revelations had opened doors that had previously seemed impossible. "Do you accept?" David asked, already knowing the answer. Sarah smiled. "Of course, we have a lot of work ahead of us." That evening, over dinner at the Goldstein home, something unthinkable months before, the family celebrated the changes. Isaac raised a "Toast to truth," he said, his voice laced with emotion, "and to the love that allows us to overcome it." Everyone drank, a moment of togetherness that symbolized the hope of a fresh start. As night fell over São Paulo, David and Sarah walked hand in hand. The city looked different, brighter, more hopeful. "What now?" Sarah asked. David kissed her forehead. "Now we build our future, together." On the horizon, the skyscrapers of São Paulo lit up, silent witnesses to a story of love, truth, and reconciliation. But something hung in the air, a feeling that this was only the first part of a much bigger story, a story that was just beginning.